I mentioned how we tell ourselves stories and sometimes tell ourselves sensational stories, and understanding that and some of those narratives that we develop helps to develop self-awareness, develops a more objective position when we have to share our points of view, and also can manage self-sabotaging dialogue that undermines confidence. And we know that anything that undermines confidence can undermine executive presence. I want you to take note as we explore these habits of mind. They're also called cognitive distortions. They're called distortions because when we use them habitually to the negative, we are usually in a space of our feeling brain more than we are our thinking brain, no matter how logical we think we are. So for some of these, I have offered explanations because they may not be self-explanatory, but for many of them, the name speaks for itself. So overgeneralization, I want you to think about if this is something you might do. With overgeneralization, there are one or two instances that are construed as a whole pattern. So a client may receive unfavorable feedback and conclude that they aren't competent enough to perform. And that can be a really easy habit to pick up if you are in a setting that is not given to consistent positive feedback, especially when there's a lot of competition or it's high pressure. That constant worry about whether you're measuring up can distort your thinking even when you're doing well. Mental filtering. It's when the focus is on negative information in the presence of positive information. So if mental filtering, an associate might ignore a long history of a track record that is strong, even, again, they know they're doing well, but if they're given unfavorable feedback, they totally ignore that. Disqualifying positives, that's where a positive might be acknowledged. So you're not ignoring the positive, but you might totally reject it or diminish the accomplishment. So you may say, although my senior associate may have given me favorable feedback, he just came off the golf course and he was just in a really good mood that day. I don't think my performance was that strong. Jumping to conclusions in mind reading. That's when someone is really sure that they know what someone else is thinking. And if someone has a more passive communication style and they are reluctant to even engage in anything that might feel like natural conflict, they may jump to conclusions because they really don't want to hold the conversation. Again, someone may see an unpleasant expression and believe that they are displeased with themselves. I had this conversation with a client recently where he was talking about how in meetings he is constantly trying to look at facial expressions on the screen. And I told him he might not want to look at facial expressions on the screen because he tends to think that if someone doesn't have a pleasant demeanor, there is something wrong with him. But we know we can look unpleasant for various reasons. Someone could have just gotten bad news. Someone could be hungry. But if we personalize everything, we think it's about us. So fortune telling, it's a belief about the future that is established based on a little bit of evidence. And sometimes we can feed our own sense of status because most people like to believe that they are very intuitive. And typically the older we get, we think that we're very intuitive just because we've lived long enough to see so much. But that is not always the case and is not always true. So a professional may be certain that they will never find fulfillment in their career since it just hasn't happened yet. Emotional reasoning. I think in our everyday walk, we really see this in the arena of politics. That's when if someone feels strongly about it, it must be true. Because again, when we feel strongly, we have physiological sensations, and surely if my palm is sweating and my heart is pounding and I'm wanting to go out there and do something, what I'm feeling must be true, and I'm going to convince myself of that even if it's unreasonable. Strong suspicions and unctions are evidence enough. personalization. So a motivation or a blame is assigned to oneself, even when it's unreasonable. So say, for example, we go to a restaurant and someone has an unpleasant experience, and we might assign it to ourselves, even if what happened was totally beyond our control. Fallacy of fairness. And I think I see this particularly with young professionals because they're still idealistic and they think that life oftentimes is going to be fair. But we know that that is often not true. So when we have those fallacies of fairness, we feel like we're just in our responses, which are typically anger, resentment, or hopelessness. And that is why that thought pattern is unhelpful. And the thing that we have to recognize about thoughts is that they're neither right or wrong, good or bad. They're either helpful or harmful. Catastrophizing, that's when we always believe the worst is probably going to happen. And if you know anybody who's been through trauma, you may have seen this thought process. And it's one way of making sure that the shoe doesn't drop on you unaware, that you're always prepared for something. But typically, the worst does not happen. Should statements. It's very common for us to should on people. And that's when we have rigid expectations for ourselves or others. But the problem with that is that it can bring shame. And it's not that should is a bad word. It's not that we should never use the word should. The issue is when we put those expectations on someone else who may not be aligned with that purpose or may not be aligned with those values, it becomes a problem. And we're going to have an example of that in a case study later on as well. Labeling, that's a descriptor or judgment that is assigned based on a limited number of experiences. So instead of describing someone's behavior, we might use a broad generalization. Even when I describe one's characteristics, I might say they use sarcasm versus saying they are sarcastic. I know it sounds like semantics, but once we've used a generalized label, it is really hard to see that person any other way. And we typically end up disqualifying positives. Control fallacies, that's where there's an imbalanced belief of either being in total control or at the hands of fate. And in most situations, as the saying goes, the two things that are certain are death and taxes. In most situations in life, other than those that are dire, we do have some element of agency that we can execute in order to bring about the change that is desired. Fallacy of change. That's when we expect others to change if just pressure them hard enough or just encourage them hard enough. And that is connected to a control fallacy because I think if I can control it in some type of way, I can bring about a sense of certainty for myself. Always being right. That is when we believe we must always be right. And in a profession where folks' careers are really all about their being right for the good of the organization, company, or firm, it's pretty common. But the problem is when we have such inflexibility that we can't be agile enough to grow when we're wrong. All or nothing, that is when there's an inability or unwillingness to see shades of gray. So when we make these assumptions, we don't engage in quality thinking or meaningful conversations, and that is the big problem. So you might ask, Michele, when do you use or how do you use this list of cognitive distortions? Well, they're particularly useful when we're talking about situational apprehension. I spoke with a client recently who said she was a firecracker when she's in front of an audience, but when she speaks with her, those senior to her, she has that degree of apprehension. So we had a conversation of what it means to have environmental mismatch. And it's also a fallacy that confidence is always consistent. And we talked about confidence being situational. So being able to identify why is your thinking shifting from one space to another? And I can tell you another trend that I have noticed, especially with SWA clients, is that if some of our clients have had really strict authoritarian parenting, they tend to respond to their senior associates that way. And that typically comes out in their sharing, et cetera. So a lot of this work is about just noticing trends. And I also do this in the second session so that I can connect whatever is discovered to a growth target that we identified in session 1.